National Labor Federalism, the Emergence of Local Labor Standards Enforcement as a Field. And our plan for this hour-long session is to start with some context, and then we'll pose some questions to Lorelei, Pat, and Betty. I'll encourage you to keep those comments and questions coming in the chat. And if I don't incorporate them into the questions as we go, then we'll save some time in the final minutes to make sure that we cover them. Thanks so much for joining us. And let me start now by giving a little bit of context. As the possibility of enacting stronger and more expansive labor and employment policies at the federal level has been largely foreclosed since the 90s, advocates have increasingly turned to state and local level government to seek improvements. In recent years, cities across the country have adopted local laws such as higher minimum wage, paid sick and safe time, wage theft prevention, ban the box, and fair scheduling laws. Some cities that have enacted local policies in an effort to ensure robust implementation have adopted the strategy of setting up their own local agencies for labor law enforcement. The city of San Francisco was by far the pioneer in this area. It established an agency for enforcement of labor standards in 2001. Not until 2015 did we get the next office in Seattle, and later that same year, New York City. Since 2015, other cities and counties have formed or taken steps toward forming agencies. There are now agencies or local government mechanisms for labor law enforcement in LA County, Chicago, Philly, Baltimore, Minneapolis, Tacoma, San Jose, Santa Clara County, and Washington, D.C. These agencies are developing protocols and procedures, evaluating the legal and political boundaries of their powers, innovating new strategies, and pressing for stronger enforcement tools. And today we have leaders of the three largest of them. San Francisco, which was the first, as I said, the Office of Labor Standards Enforcement is now led by Pat Mulligan, who comes out of the building trades, the carpenters. Prior to OLSE, he served as the director of City Build, where he oversaw San Francisco's local hire ordinance and first source hiring program. While at City Build, Pat was also responsible for monitoring the compliance of both federal and former redevelopment agency hiring goals, as well as managing and expanding a nationally recognized workforce training program. In New York City, the office was established in November of 2015, led by the fabulous Lorelei Salas, who was appointed commissioner of the New York City Department of Consumer Affairs in 2016. She's an accomplished labor law advocate who has been committed to fighting inequality throughout her career. Under her leadership, the agency's efforts are directed towards industries in which predatory practices are prevalent, and the agency regularly utilizes data to inform its strategic enforcement of consumer and worker protection laws. In 2009, Lorelei was nominated by President Obama as the Wage and Hour Administrator at the U.S. Department of Labor. She was the Director of Legal Services at Catholic Migration Services, and she's worked at the New York State Attorney General's Office in litigation. And before that, she held multiple senior management positions at the New York Department of Labor. And finally, we'll be joined by Betty Duong, who is the leader of the Office of Labor Standards Enforcement in the County of Santa Clara, the seat of power for Silicon Valley. Betty served as Budget and Policy Director to Santa Clara County Supervisor Cindy Chavez. She took a personal leave of absence in 2016 to manage the successful Measure A $950 million housing bond campaign. She's an employment and labor law attorney with almost 20 years of experience in community advocacy. And I just want to thank you all so much for taking time out on a Sunday to participate in this discussion. So if we could just begin by asking each of you to just give us a little bit of context. Can you say a little bit about your agencies, the laws you enforce, the size of the staff, and the annual budget? That would be great. And we'll start with Pat.
Great. Well, thanks, Janice. I appreciate being here. As you stated before, the San Francisco Office of Labor Standards was established 19 years ago by ordinance through action of the San Francisco Board of Supervisors and signed by Mayor Willie Brown at the time. Originally, it was conceived for enforcement of San Francisco prevailing wage requirements, and since has expanded to include nearly 30 additional labor laws established through San Francisco voters and through San Francisco Board of Supervisors, including San Francisco's minimum wage, among the highest in the country, San Francisco paid sick leave ordinance, lactation in the workplace, healthcare security ordinance, paid parental leave, family friendly, formula retail employee rights ordinances, contractor minimum compensation under 12E, and there's a whole list of contract requirements as well that our office enforces. Our budget is approximately about $8.5 million, and we have 30 staff members, almost all compliance officers. We have a few administrative analysts and some administrative support, but I'd say 17 of those positions are compliance officers. Thanks, Janice.
Thanks, Pat. Lorelei.
Hi, Janice. Thank you so much for having me. And I hope everyone is safe and healthy during this time. So looking forward to a conversation. So the Department of Consumer and Worker Protection, renamed as Department of Consumer and Worker Protection a year ago, houses the Office of Labor Policy and Standards, which is the office Janice mentioned. Came into being in 2015, but actually didn't really start ramping up operations until 2016, which is when the office was placed within this agency, an agency that has been around for 50 years and primarily enforcing consumer protection laws and licensing over 70,000 businesses in New York City. So the Office of Labor Policy and Standards is one of the divisions of the agency, and as a whole in the agency, we have close to 400 staffers, but in this particular division, we have between 30 to 40, depending on vacancies that we have unfulfilled right now, unfilled and unfulfilled. And I would say that the budget for the agency is about $40 million, where the budget for the Office of Labor Policy and Standards is between $1.5 and $2 million. And in this division, we have investigators, we have attorneys, we have outreach staff. And today, I have to say that we are actually trying to use as many tools as we have throughout the agency to help in this work, which is so very important right now in terms of protecting workers.
Thanks, Lorelei. Betty, Duong, are you there? Hooray! So just need you to unmute.
I was on mute. Hi, everyone. My name is Betty Young. The D is pronounced like a Y in Vietnamese, but you would never have known that unless I shared it with you. And I run the Office of Labor Standards Enforcement at the County of Santa Clara. It is very much in large part modeled after the San Francisco Office of Labor Standards Enforcement, like so many good things are in the Bay Area, modeled after San Francisco. Our office was created by the Board of Supervisors in 2017. I was the first employee in 2018. And now we are at 5 employees in 2020. We do things a little differently. As a county-based or office agency, we don't have the same type of police powers as we would in the 15 cities that fall into the jurisdiction of the county. So what we do is that we enforce and advance labor standards through these enforcement programs where, that we've built around unique and county powers, enforcement powers and permitting powers. Those programs include the food permit program, where, we can compel compliance with existing judgments for labor violations issued by the state and federal government, conditioned on the good standing of their food permit. So, so if you have a judgment and we ask you to comply with the judgment, and you don't, we have the authority to suspend your food permit. We could do that within 2 hours. That would then shut down your business until the judgment is complied with. Our second enforcement program is the business license program. It's something that we're creating right now, and it's going to be a business license program for unincorporated county, and we're going to give the options for cities to opt into that. So they can sign on to the business license program, which then, operates very much the same way that the food permit program does, where, the good standing of your permit is conditioned on your, on you abiding with all state, federal, and local labor laws, in addition to all other laws. Our other enforcement program is contracts enforcement. As a county organization, we contract over, I think, $2 billion services per year in direct goods. That's a small economy in of itself. And so our office is also tasked with reviewing vetting all of our contractors prior to the contract, during the contract, throughout the life of the contract, contract arrangement or relationship with the county. So if you are committing labor violations, just the commission alone is a violation of the agreement and grounds for suspension and potential debarment of our relationship into the future. A last program that we're working on, that we're developing right now, is the construction permit program, very much modeled after the same way that our food permit and business license program is modeled, where, you know, we are the county are the issuers of these building permits, and for construction sites where we know that violations can be rampant because of particularly worker populations there. If you are in violation, that may mean the denial of a current permit, pending permit application, a future permit application, or current permit application even. So we always look for opportunities where does the county's power exist to leverage for enforcement. That's how we advance our labor standards here. That's the first way. The second way is through a labor standards outreach and education initiative. It's funded at $1.5 million a year, and those come in the form of contracts with smaller CBOs that represent the communities that we're trying to reach. And so they become our partners in education, worker engagement, worker outreach. Our initiative fund also provides for a workers' rights clinic to refer clients to if their issues require more legal advice and representation. With that, 1.5 million also funds a legal advice line where, you know, you call the number and you get an attorney on the line in one of 7 languages. And we hope to expand the languages some more.
All right.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So thank you. So fantastic. I'm getting some questions about my background. So I'll just tell you, this is my garden and it's sort of my pride and joy. So let me just ask as the next question for everyone, can you say a little bit about the biggest issues that workers have come to the agency or to community partners with during the pandemic, the sectors you've seen the biggest problems with? And just, it would be great to hear how you've been grappling with keeping workers safe during the pandemic. And particularly, I know there have been a lot of issues with paid sick and safe time. So why don't we start this time with Lorelei?
Yes, thank you. And I realized that I didn't say much about the type of work that the office does. So I will mention it now because paid safe and sick leave, obviously it's like a huge life-saving benefit that finally, you know, like the federal government, even the state government in New York finally recognizes something that was needed, very much needed. New York City had its own paid safe and sick leave law since 2014, and it's probably the bulk of the work that we do around enforcement, in addition to fair work week laws, and the Freelancers Isn't Free Act, which are 2 other big pieces of legislation that we enforce. So workers have been coming to us from, like I would say, the last week of February. We saw a huge influx of calls and inquiries and complaints around paid safe and sick leave. Employers who just, it was very unclear what the guidance was, what people were supposed to be doing. If they found out someone may have been exposed to the virus, workers were really worried about it. They didn't know what their rights were. We were continuing to enforce the law. But I have to say that a lot of it was also workers wanting to understand what their rights were, but not necessarily wanting to file complaints. People were very, very afraid about losing their jobs. So in the fast food industry is where we saw a huge spike of complaints, right? So employers who were considered to be essential services, essential businesses, because they're selling food, and workers who already were prior to COVID-19 suffering like all types of violations around paid safe and sick leave law and retaliation complaints, all kinds of things, were even more affected this time around. Construction, as Betty mentioned, is another area where it was very unclear what construction can continue, what cannot continue. Workers didn't know, and the guidance, again, was very confusing at times. And people who were working in essential businesses, such as retail, selling food, or pharmacies that were open, but who also were very worried about, is my employer supposed to give me a face covering or a face mask, gloves? What are we supposed to do? Can we let people into the store without face coverings? You know, all of that we just had hundreds of calls on those issues. And just recently, we have now begun enforcing as a city the New York State guidelines for reopening during phase 1. New York City is a bit behind around the state, but this is going to be an effort that is taking not just my agency. We play a role, but it's a citywide effort. So it'll be interesting. I'll be happy to talk more about it later, about how we're coordinating our efforts around this very important work of protecting workers and helping employers, right, to come back.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Lorelei. Pat?
Yeah, I would say San Francisco hasn't seen an uptick, I think, in labor complaints violations, but I think similarly, we've seen a lot of questions regarding concerns around, say, provisions around the public health orders for shelter in place, social distancing, business closures. Those are enforced through a new task force reporting to the Emergency Operations Center out of San Francisco and comprised of municipal or administrative enforcement officers from various groups. So including Department of Building Inspection, Entertainment Commission, and our office. So they would enforce appropriate business closures, appropriate use of social distancing for employers. So even though we're fielding those questions, we're not directly responding to them. What's consumed us more is a Board of Supervisors implemented emergency labor protections during this time. So there's a public health emergency leave ordinance that provides for additional 80 hours for employers of 500 or more. So basically covering the gap in the federal provisions. So with, just kind of the immediacy of it and the fact that it was implemented within 7 days of being introduced, there was a lot of questions. Certainly we had to propagate extensive administrative guidance for employers and for workers around that time, but it has been successfully implemented. There was some wrangling with some employers, ones who say aren't accustomed to some of these, rapidly changing laws. There's also an employee protection emergency ordinance, which mandates some of the same provisions in some of the public health orders, but expands it to on-demand delivery services, clearly stating that providing language with overlap around gig employers. So again, providing guidance and responding to a lot of questions. We have had some enforcement action around both of those, but not a lot. I think it's been handled, I think the public is very aware and people are complying appropriately. We've also had some, through executive order of the mayor, an expansion of San Francisco's healthcare accountability ordinance for specific, say, food delivery service contracts. And again, we have managed through that. We have a very active legislative branch here in San Francisco. There's labor laws currently pending before the Board of Supervisors right now. So we're anticipating that implementation as well. But we're holding it together.
Betty?
So the first thing we saw right away once the COVID became a new reality for us here in the county was that our OLSE advice line, which is typically an attorney staff advice line for workers with potential grievances or labor violations at work, were turning into calls for looking for assistance, because now we were having workers financially impacted by COVID-19. So those calls started flooding in, and we pivoted by creating an additional hotline, which we call the CAN 19 hotline. Right now it's Santa Clara CAN, Santa Clara Assistance Navigation for COVID-19. And so that particular hotline has about 35 intake staff persons, navigators we call them, and what they're doing is they're navigating workers who are financially impacted by COVID-19 to resources. So that line is getting about, I think at last check, they're averaging about 2,000 calls a week for that. I know, insane, right? But which is great, because at the same time, part of the script is do you know about our workers' rights training? Do you have any concerns about any violations in the workplace? Can we patch you to it? And that hotline lives on the same phone system as our OLSE advice line, so the transition is seamless when the call starts as a resource call and turns into a legal advice situation. The second thing that we've done here in the county, our county embedded the OLSE into our emergency operations system center. All right, so yeah. that's kind of like the mini government now that just runs all the COVID response. So they have us at the table with them to make sure where we can be embedded into the process. So right now, our team, our OLSE has, we have the Department of Environmental Health, our Department of Planning, our County Council Office, and our District Attorney's Office. staff from each office forming an enforcement unit around labor standards and workers' rights. So what we do too is that our little group is also tasked with enforcing the protections that are included with the health orders, especially the required social distancing protocols in the workplace for workers. We provide ourselves as a resource through direct mailings, emails to industry leaders, through our outreach and education initiative to let workers know that you can call us and we will follow up with the employer and keep you anonymous if that's what your wish is. And the goal is the employer at this time, to make sure that they're abiding by all COVID required protections in place to protect the health of the worker. We realize that that's the only thing right now on the front lines for essential workers in terms of their health. And then we still have our OLSE advice line going, and prior to COVID, the calls that we would get on the advice line would be 100 calls a week, 200 calls a week would be a max. Now they're at 1,000 calls a week.
Wow.
So the calls are coming flooding in. There's still the wage and hour violations are still running rampant. Extremely hostile work environments with emboldened employers like really preying on desperation of workers to force them to do additional things. So those are the type of stories that we're seeing.
Lorelei and Pat, are you seeing that as much?
I know we haven't seen rampant violations. I mean, but we've been in enforcement in San Francisco for 20 years. I think employers are very aware of our office. I think we do considerable amount of outreach. Yeah, no, actually, the irony is we're seeing a lot of action around the emergency ordinances, but the existing ones, a lot of the complaints are coming out of service sector employers, and their people aren't working. I think that's one of the biggest challenges.
Yeah.
And sometimes people are seeking assistance through our office, and though there are provisions in San Francisco through the Office of Economic and Workforce Development, certainly through the state EDD, social services, but I feel like that's the broader issue is a lot of service sector workers are unemployed.
Right.
And almost the entire hospitality, convention sector, and secondary, employment that's peripheral to that, much of that is shut down. So that's actually where we would field a lot of complaints, especially wage and hour, paid sick leave. So yeah, we have not seen a spike, except outside of the emergency ordinances, which we're fielding a lot of calls and questions and some enforcement action. Yeah.
Lorelei?
I would say, I can't give you data. I can tell you though that we have also, like Betty, we had to set up a separate hotline for workers in response to like the reopening, right? And making sure that people knew where to go to if they had complaints. This is the first week. A lot of the calls Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday were about workers who will call in and say, my employer is not following the guidelines, or my employer should not be calling me back to work because we're not one of the industries that is allowed to reopen. But I am not going to give you my name, and I'm not going to give you the employer's name because I already told my employer that they're not doing the right thing. And if you show up, I'm going to get fired, even if you say that you're there in response to nothing, no complaints, just proactively. So people did not want to give their names and numbers. I just wrote an op-ed yesterday, Fridays, asking the public to please tell us, because we can't just be placing the burden on workers right now. Workers who, like in New York City, like 230,000 workers subject to, vulnerable to layoffs, mostly undocumented workers. People need money to feed themselves. Unfortunately, we're seeing that a lot of small business owners are reopening their doors because there's no other way. Like workers need the money and they're going to go back. So it's pretty dire, I think, for me, like seeing the situation where how can we support the workers? I think we need to provide even more services in response to basic needs so people can still wait it out and be more patient before they come back to work. But it's the first week of reopening, so I don't know what will happen in a week or two when we add even more industries, right? So we really want to encourage business workers basically to come to us, but I don't think we're going to see a response like that where workers are going to be putting themselves on the line and be, again, risk getting fired and going back to the unemployed pool. So we're going to start next week doing proactive visits to businesses in certain neighborhoods where we know there's a lot of, especially maybe less knowledge about the requirements, a lot of immigrant small business owners. So we want to go just bring the guidance itself, right, in different languages, and make sure there's the employers feel a presence, right, that we are there monitoring.
So I think we'll just, maybe let's just hold on this and talk about this for a minute. You know, as the recession, as we're heading into opening up and a horrible recession, we know that violations go up and that workers are afraid to come forward or cautious about coming forward because they're so eager to hold on to their jobs and worried. So I'm curious about how you guys are thinking about enforcement during this period. How do you balance support for small business while ensuring that wage standards are being maintained? Are you getting pressure to ease up on enforcement? What kinds of communication are you having with small businesses? Is that changing at all? How are you thinking about strategy going forward? And I'll just throw one more question because I don't want to leave COVID. I know that when COVID hit, everybody went virtual, including enforcement. So I'd just like you guys to talk a little bit about lessons learned or big ahas from having your entire agencies having to go virtual and kind of what you'll take from that experience. So Betty, we'll start with you this time, okay? You gotta unmute though.
COVID times, I constantly am muted. So you know, we it's something that we're still working on. We especially with our most robust enforcement program is with food permits, and the majority of restaurants in the South Bay are smaller. They have less than 10 employees, so they classify as a small business. We continue to take I think our original approach has always been very collaborative, where we give them the option of a payment plan to stay any adverse actions against their food permit to allow them to stay open. But you know, during these times with COVID, there's additional violations that's attached to our enforcement now, because our local health orders do include protections for workers as part of the law now through officer, and with OLSE as part of the enforcement procedure. So we continue to take the approach that we always said, that, you know, we want to find a way, provide a way out for businesses out of non-compliance, out of violation, because we want them to stay in business, but we want them to do so as good employers. Something that's really come up that I think illustrates this is that a surprise to me is that during COVID, we received a lot of correspondence from nail salons. So here in Santa Clara County, the second largest population of Vietnamese outside of Vietnam, the nail salon industry is, like, you know, it's synonymous with the Vietnamese economy here in Santa Clara County. And, you know, this is no secret at this point, but what they've done through their leadership and their organizations is that they have been violating misclassification laws as a way of business, as a method of operating for decades. And so it's coming to light now, because with COVID, all of their workers went and applied for EDD and, you know, identified themselves as an employee, because I'm reading what independent contractors, that's not me, but that's what they've been listed for all the years that they've been working. So the nail salons now are asking us to help broker, like, how do we get out of this? We want to make things right. We want to stay in business. We realize we're going to have to pay something. How do we make this right? So that right there has the conversation just started about a week ago, and this is like one of our, you know, to your question, like, how do we balance support for small business and ensuring that wage standards are maintained? This is a demonstration of that right now, where we're trying to work with our state representatives to see, I mean, the people are going to have to get paid, but how can we go about it to allow businesses, to these nail salons, to still stay in business? And it's also, like, really encouraging that we have an opportunity to move a whole industry, a whole sector of the beauty industry into compliance.
You know, we have a question coming to you that we'll just ask you quickly before we go on to Pat and Lorelei. David Weil wants to know how you're prioritizing responding to 2,000 incoming complaints right now. Do you have a method for triage?
So the 2000, the weekly 2000 count is from workers seeking resources. So they're not necessarily complaints, and out of those 2000 calls, it does turn into complaints. Not all of them are complaints, but when complaints do come up in conversation, they're patched over to the OLSE advice line. And we prioritize these on a weekly basis. The first priority we look for is like, what are we able to do? Because, you know, again, we have very specific enforcement programs to the nature of county authority and county powers. We can't go into a city and provide direct enforcement unless they contract us to. We're not there yet. I think we're half a year old in the office officially. But that's what we're working towards. Okay. But, you know, we prioritize it by, does this fall into one of our enforcement programs where we have existing powers? But across the board, you know, also violations where it's immediate, you know, like my boss is allowing people to dine in the restaurant. And we're not allowed to do that, but they're making me come to work and no one's social distancing. At that point, we send in like a sheriff's deputy to tell the business you can't do that right away. So there's those complaints. Then there's complaints where it's like, I'm suffering a violation at work. We refer them to the OLSE advice line for limited legal representation at our workers' rights clinic. And, you know, they have their own triaging process that's always been in place. But what we've also done is increase their funding during this time, emergency funding, because there is greater need. They've hired more attorneys, we've staffed up.
Okay. Lorelei?
I'm so jealous. Every time Betty explains something, I'm so jealous. All these additional resources that like, I had to stand up a hotline, but basically move people who are investigating cases to answer the phone calls. So we have 0 additional resources, and that is a huge challenge to do this work. So I want to respond to the COVID-19. This is not just a worker protection issue, right? I mean, obviously I am all on for worker protections, but certainly COVID-19 safety guidelines non-compliance is a matter of public health, right? It affects everyone. So it's certainly, I have to say, we were not necessarily involved in we're not the ones managing the enforcement across the city for the safety guidelines. We are one of the agencies, and I remember reviewing the training tool for the inspectors that were going to go out in the field to respond to complaints. And one instruction was, tell the business that you're there responding to a complaint. And I was like, why? You know, there's like, sometimes like, even like thinking about like, why would we need to tell a business there was ever a complaint? There's no need to do that and antagonize an employer already. And right now we know workers are very, very worried about this, right? So that, you know, I feel like we still need to do even more work to make sure that all of the right brains are at the table in putting together this response. But we're getting there. And in terms of, yes, we certainly have been asked to be very, at least for the initial few weeks, to make sure that businesses are getting educated and not so much feeling like the stick of the penalty. Our public health violations can range up to $1,000. So that's some incentive, right, to comply. But the primary goal right now, the mission right now for the next 2 weeks at least, is just purely to educate businesses. And small businesses are getting a lot of support from the administration. We have distributed over 2 million first face coverings for free to businesses across the city. Some of them are able to access grants if they need to invest in additional protective equipment for their businesses. But I do, you know, for me, I mean, it's super important that, I mean, this is a reminder to everyone, right? Because, you know, if a business is not complying with the safety guidelines, the businesses around that should be worried, because we can all be forced to go back to, you know, like day 0, right? When we had to like all stay home. So it's really something that everyone needs to take seriously. And we're doing a lot of investment in educating businesses right now. With respect to paid safe and sick leave and fair work week laws, we continue to enforce those laws, but we also have tried to be more accommodating to businesses during this time, right? If the violations are occurring during COVID-19, not if you are an employer who was always violating these laws before the crisis, but if you're now finding yourself in a difficult situation and it's harder to comply with some of these protections, we try to seek very quickly relief for the person who filed a complaint and push for forward-looking compliance, rather than say immediately we will turn all of these into workplace-wide investigations, because we don't have the bandwidth, the capacity, and the businesses will probably not be able to afford that anyway. So number one thing, start complying right away. We can continue to argue about the past violations, but compliance needs to start today with paid safe and sick leave, for instance, right? That's our approach.
That's great. Pat?
Yeah, thanks, Janice. We're sensitive to the plight of small businesses, especially as many of them are closed under current public health orders or restricted under current public health orders. And those are effectively enforced, those provisions, through this task force, which I've touched on, which our office is involved in. That being said, our priority is to enforce labor law and to protect workers' rights. We, at this time, will consider some leniency in terms of response time from employers, from document requests, and maybe even some payment plans, but never consideration certainly around restitution of workers. In fact, I would say culturally, the protocols of our office during shelter in place is the number one priority. Knowing that certain sectors of employment, they're facing 70, 80% unemployment. Our main goal is to get as much restitution out to workers as possible right now. And we have, just in these last few weeks, over $2 million in restitution out to workers, and much more coming. Much of our audits are academic, so I think that's effectively performed at home. We follow up with complaints. Usually it's a comprehensive audit, unless we think it's just maybe an individual occurrence or some sort of minor oversight. But by and large, most of our audits are comprehensive, 3 years, covering all employees, and we'll even scrutinize around, maybe multiple labor laws in San Francisco. Like, frequently, if there's a paid sick leave violation, there's also a healthcare security ordinance violation, which is usually far more costly in terms of both penalties and restitution to workers. So I feel like the team has really been turning the wheel here. We're still in the office in spite of requirements of social distancing periodically. But the main reason for that is to go through the mail, make sure restitution checks are properly processed. So we're doing that. Somebody's in the office every day, usually one person, at least just to process payments. Because again, that is our number one priority during this crisis.
Okay. One of the questions I got from you guys was, or a question from Peter Fugiel was, are you worried about the fiscal crisis and how it's going to impact your offices? Are you getting any kind of, and I know I cut you off, Pat, so finish your last thought, sorry.
No, great. Hey, I mean, as you know, Janice, and a couple of people might know, I had a very full career working as a construction professional for 25 years before coming into public service 8 years ago. I was always anticipating an economic slowdown and a recession. Right. And I've always been like that, even since I've come into public service. We're pretty well insulated, given how our office is structured and the finances. We're already getting some early direction around 15% cuts across the board. But I feel we're going to handle that without any reduction in staff at this time. And I feel very leveraged in this process. And we've been planning for this, really since I've been here. So I'm feeling pretty comfortable. We have a lot of support from our Board of Supervisors and the Mayor's office. They both consider this an essential service, labor standards enforcement. So I feel like we're not quite, on the same bar as, say, emergency service, first tier responders, but certainly we're just below that. And I think that's the public perception here in San Francisco. Okay,
so Pat and Betty, I'm getting a lot of questions in the chat and had planned on asking you about the passage of the Independent Contracting Bill, AB 5, which presumes employee status in California. And if you could talk a little bit about how this is impacting the work of your agency, and just care to comment in any way. Betty, I know you talked about the nail salon workers. That's fascinating. But in general, both of you, if you could talk to us about how AB 5 is affecting the laws you're enforcing, the way you're enforcing, all that, that would be great. Pat, since you're already here, why don't you start, and then we'll get to Betty.
Sure, thanks, Janice. Actually, we were really encouraged by AB5 and prior to that, the Dynamex decision, which was a court ruling basically addressing some of the worker misclassification. We had active investigations prior to that with on-demand delivery services and rideshare services at that time. I won't say any names, but I think some people might know what, what employers I might be speaking of. But it was difficult. It was difficult with the lack of legal precedents and legislative support. That actually helped to reinforce our position and advance our investigations, where we're really fighting over just even be able to conduct an audit, to get key information from employers. We've had success getting that information. We just, literally 2 weeks ago, settled out in on-demand delivery service employer, active here in San Francisco, a 3-year comprehensive audit, $750,000, payment in full last week. So we'll be doing distribution of those restitution payments to workers in the next coming weeks. And it has helped to kind of reinforce, again, our other investigations against on-demand delivery service workers and rideshare employers. It's tough. I think there's still elements that could be worked out in the court. I think that's a lot of the reticence, I think, from some, say, state attorney's office or some of the other municipal enforcement offices, municipal city attorney's offices as well. And also, I've seen this in other situations where, a city attorney's office might be out-resourced by a multinational, multi-billion-dollar corporation. I mean, again, without stating names, some of them have access to very, high-powered attorneys with long resumes. This is a do-or-die situation for some of these employers. They are going to spare no expense to challenge this at all costs. And we see that almost, every week, every other week in the newspaper. But I am encouraged by litigation from both the State Attorney General's office, including 3 other city attorney's office, San Francisco, LA, and San Diego, around taking on Uber and Lyft on this matter. For us, we're labor enforcement. We're going to conduct our audits in the same manner as we always do.
Betty?
So our approach is going to be through outreach and education, just through our existing channels of making sure that workers are aware of what resources are available to them, what rights they have. We started out earlier this year with this really involved campaign, through paid media, through social platforms, through all of our direct engagement points, to let people know, to clarify the myths around AB5 and who it harms and who it doesn't. There was a lot of misinformation that we found here in the county, and once people realized what it was about, it was general support for this bill. And that was really one of our primary focuses for this year of operation until COVID hit. So it's been tough because it's basically put a hard stop on any of the work we were going to do, because now all of our messaging is around health protections for workers in the workplace. And we really hope that as we transition into recovery operations at the county, away from emergency operations, as the COVID crisis becomes more managed, that we could resume our engagement with our community, with our workers and employers around AB5. One thing that we have been able to do, being embedded in the emergency operations system, is make sure that our county does not enter into any contracts with certain employers, certain rideshare companies, certain delivery companies. Some of our cities have done that to help with the COVID response, but we as a position, because internally speaking, we're gonna wage war, on this issue. We're not going to contract with them during this time. So that's where we're at the moment.
All right. So Lorelei, I know you don't have an AB5, at least not yet, but I'm curious. I know that you've been doing a lot of work with platform workers and gig workers, and if you could talk a little bit about that, that would be great.
So we do in New York City have the Freelance Isn't Free Act, which is the first law in the country, to maybe still the only one that actually requires that the companies that contract freelancers pay them on time. And I really love this law because it was designed in a really thoughtful manner to put in the right incentives in the law so that at my agency, we can resolve those cases of late payment or non-payment generally within 3 months of the filing of a complaint by a freelancer. And this means that freelancers are not having to go to small claims court to try to fight for the money that they've already earned. So it's a great program. We have only 1 or 2 people working on it. And I think the successes are very significant. So we're very much supportive of expanding benefits to freelance workers, and recently testified at a hearing at a city council where council member Brad Lander, who some of you may know, has introduced an expansion to the paid safe and sick leave law, which would then cover workers employed in like Uber and Lyft, for instance, right? Drivers. So we are in support of it. We do have concerns around implementation and making sure that there's clear guidance for both workers and the companies that employ them on what are the factors we would be looking at. So we'll see, we'll see what happens. I think it makes a lot of sense. A lot of these workers are already misclassified. So this law would just make it so that it's clear that they are entitled to the benefits of an employee. So stay tuned.
Yeah, all right. So I have a couple more questions, and I'm trying to save the rest of the time for the great questions we're getting in the chat that I haven't been fielding. So I guess I wanted to ask you guys, some people argue that we've been hit with 3 terrifying pandemics at once. And I wanted to ask you in particular about whether in this moment of reckoning around racial inequity, are there particular issues that Black workers have come to your agency about historically, and how this moment around the Black Lives Matter movement is impacting your thinking about the work of the agency, what you're hearing from Black workers, and also what you're hearing from community partners and other organizations. Lorelei, do you want to start?
Sure, yes. So, so I'll say a couple of things about this because you probably have seen the statistics, of COVID-19 case rates and how they have disproportionately impacted Black and Brown communities. And in New York City, we have this map put together by the Department of Health that shows us 27 neighborhoods where primarily Black and Latino residents have been falling ill to the disease and are struggling, right? Struggling to recover, and also suffering from the financial impact of this disease. And now we're seeing all of the, the appropriate response right now from our communities to the killing of George Floyd and others. And I think it's a lot. It's a lot. I think that when we think about the work that we're doing, I had my team go back and look at our paid sick leave complaint data and our fair work week complaint data, which primarily applies to the fast food industry. And we saw that a lot of the complaints and the enforcement work is happening in those neighborhoods where we know are the communities that are most affected by the COVID-19 crisis. So in a way, our work is sort of aligned already to try to target these issues in these communities, same communities where we operate financial empowerment centers. These are communities that are typically unbanked or underbanked. So there was a lot of work already happening in these neighborhoods. But I would say that one thing that the mayor recently launched is a task force to really look at the steps that we should be taking as a city to really target these disparities and to have a vision of equality as we think about the recovery, right? And we've had continuous engagement with stakeholders who have come to us and said, these are the 3 or 4 or 5 things that are super urgent for us, and you need to look into. And it's a lot. And I think with the financial crisis that is affecting our city, New York, we will see that we will lose resources to do the work that we're doing. And it's going to be a really difficult task of prioritizing what work gets done and doesn't get done. one thing that I'll just put out there too is that, there's a commitment now to divert some of the funding from the NYPD, the police department, to other types of responses, right? So that we can have a better response to communities issues than just law enforcement by PD. But one perfect example of that is street vendors enforcement. We have a lot of street vendors in New York City, and typically it's the type of work that PD did. The mayor said that's going to be going to civilian enforcement agencies. Guess who will be one? And that I think is super appropriate. It makes a lot of sense, but it also means that without additional resources, something's got to give, right? And so I think that yes, there's a commitment, I think right now, especially right now, to be super critical of the work that we're doing and really look deeply and think about how are we not serving these communities and what can we do better. And I'll end this by saying that my team has been amazing. If I say we're going to do this now, we're responding to all these safety and health complaints. We have consumer protection inspectors doing the work with our Office of Labor Policy and Standards. So we're going to do whatever it takes to get the work done. But I think there's just a lot. I think it's calling for almost like a reorganization of government resources right now. And, it's the time maybe. Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of an amazing moment, huh?
Yeah.
Pat?
Yeah. Well, I would say really, even before, these recent tragedies, I could say with the election of our current Mayor London Breed, she was really kind of forcing the issue of cultural sensitivity to challenge implicit bias among all city departments and staff, as an African-American woman and a person with really compelling personal stories and history. She's really kind of made that part of the fabric of the city and county of San Francisco. She's spoken openly at some of these rallies, and I think really done a commendable job of kind of like leading the city through both this pandemic as well as this cultural crisis and awakening. I'd like to think that San Francisco is really at the front end of these matters. Certainly, she has fought to support diversity throughout all city departments, and certainly is front and center with the police department and police commissioners as well to address any sort of matters that might resemble this. But certainly a consideration for our office. In terms of our enforcement of labor laws, we enforce them equitably. It would be difficult for me to generalize around kind of like race issues, even within the labor laws, because they're so broad and affecting really all types of employment in San Francisco, but always a consideration. Thanks, Janice.
Betty?
So the Black Lives Matter movement and just the current state of affairs has really put up a very it's just a very clear mirror to how we've been operating as an office. Even though we're a new agency, it's no excuse, and I've been very public and very clear and candid with our community partners that, at the outset of the creation of our office, we named communities of color and the Black community as vulnerable worker populations, and that we were going to strive to serve and advance their labor standards and to be a partner in equity. But in truth, what happened was that our contracts, our partnerships have not been with any Black organizations. Yeah. And that's something that's very clear to us now. So that's something that we need to fix, during this time of, during this, to your point, what you said, Janice, this incredible time for change, right? And to course correct. So we are in the middle of conversations with the leading Black organizations in our community. We start with, fully recognizing that you weren't at the table with us before. That was a huge misstep, and we're here to correct it now, to have the community inform us. How do we focus our work through a lens of racial equity for the Black community? Because that would also help inform and improve our operations for the other communities we serve. So it's been a very humbling place to own up to where we've misstepped and then to move forward with that now.
Wow. So we're getting some questions from my esteemed colleagues on the chat. So let me just throw a couple of them your way. One of them is, is a question that David Weil has posed about the idea of creating grade cards, a la restaurant health grades, to give consumers information about compliance with COVID-19. And he was curious about hearing responses, I guess particularly, sorry, well, from all three of you. And then the other question that we have is, it's great that we have these wonderful offices in deep blue states and cities. And the question is, if we could, if people have ideas and strategies for how these ideas and these offices might spread to red states. So this time, let's start with Lorelei.
So I guess on the first question, the health grades issue, right now the Department of Health in New York City does give issued letter grades, right, to restaurants if they are depending on like where they are at in terms of the food safety practices, right? So that is a program that is in place. I'm not really sure if we've considered expanding that to cover also the state guidelines. I can't believe we have, but I think it's a great idea, and you know, I will definitely bring it to the team. It is like I said, it's a centralized sort of process right now. Is, you know, we have a role, but we're not managing the entire project. And I know that the Department of Health has been very much inundated with work right now, right? So I think I'll take a look at it and I think it would be great. And I'm sorry, your second question was like very broad, I think. And I'm not
sure. It was just about, you know, several people in the chat, Steve Greenhouse, Victor Naro, have raised this question of, have you heard from anybody in red states who are looking to open up offices? Do you have ideas about what it might take to spread this great model of local labor standards enforcement?
I haven't personally. I would say one thing though, just because I am very concerned about the resources invested into enforcement mechanisms at the local level, at the state level, right? And forget the federal level, but I think that we need to keep thinking really hard about other models that you, Janice, for instance, have been proposing for a long time, like co-enforcement, or really looking to push the proposal like the Empire Act, and I forget, is it PAGA in California? Mm-hmm. You know, giving tools to our communities, our legal services organizations and groups that will remain in place for a long time, to be able to help enforce the law. I really have concerns about, again, like having less money, less bodies to do this work, and without having a presence. We know that it could be beautiful language in the books, and nothing will be complied with unless we actually put our money into the resources. So I'd say we have to look at those strategies for sure, but maybe my colleagues have a better, or have been talking to people from the red states.
I have one more question for you that just came from the chat from Isaac Jabala Curtis, who I know you've probably spoken with. He said your department did something unique in creating the paid care division dedicated to enforcement in home health care, child care, and house cleaning. And could you share a little bit about what you've learned from that initiative that might be relevant to colleagues in other cities?
Thank you so much for raising that, because I've been taking notes saying I want to mention this the domestic workers issue, because I'm a former, you know, in my first few years here in the country, I worked as a nanny for full-time for like 4 years. So I'm very, very committed to doing the work on behalf of domestic workers and paid care workers. And we have this office, an office that had one staffer. That is how many resources were given to stand it up. But we do a lot of work around going proactively to investigate the home health care agencies to make sure that home health aides are getting paid their wages they're due. One thing that I wanted to mention just quickly is that we're working together with the National Domestic Workers Alliance to put together some guidance for domestic workers, because in the reopening, people are not thinking about the domestic workers who actually have already been working, right? And or will be called back to work in mass as we start reopening the rest of the industries. And so it is certainly an industry that needs to be paid closer attention and cannot be left out like it usually is, and it's not that visible. So we are right now working on materials that we're hoping will be like this is an employer's like guidance. This is what you need to do to make sure that these workers that are coming into your home are safe when they come in to do the work, right? So that's what we're doing right now. And, it's, if people have other creative ideas around how to like really raise the lives of domestic workers, I'm here. Reach out, please. We'd love to chat.
Okay. So why don't we end with last thoughts and answers from Pat and Betty. Would love to hear about your domestic worker, child care and home care worker stuff you're thinking about, Pat and Betty, and anything else you care to add, and then we'll end. I want to thank everyone for your attention, but let's just give a couple more minutes.
Yeah, hey, thanks, Janice. I would say in our office, we're always looking to expand our enforcement action and our outreach to workers and employers to bring them all into compliance and support all workers' rights in the city. With regard to the other points, public health officials here are meeting constantly, daily, hourly, with both the mayor's office, policymakers, decision makers around how to effectively open up the economy. And there are all sorts of considerations around that. Mandated testing in some sectors of employment, and then what's the response then if you do test positive? With regard to your other question around, and I maybe close it with this, around red states, I would say in most red states, Janice, if you go into the major urban centers, they have Democratic mayors. Take a state of Texas, every major city in the state of Texas has a Democratic mayor. They may not be the same types of Democrats that I see in San Francisco every day, but I think there's certainly a pathway towards having municipal labor enforcements in these major cities, even in red states. And I can close with that. Thanks, Janice.
All right, great answer. Betty, you get the last word, baby.
Oh, wow, no pressure, no pressure. Okay, so I wanted to just comment briefly on the comment from David about placards. So, because of the limited powers that we have as a county-based organization, we were able to focus on just food permit first. So our currently in Santa Clara County, the placards, the grades, it's a combo of letter grades and color codes. We have an agreement, a great partnership with our Department of Environmental Health, where that A could be changed, that green A could be changed to a red F. If the restaurant is in violation of labor standards, in violation of wage laws. So that is the partnership we have. We also have an app that allows people to, if they're out and about eating and dining, they can look up on the app that geo maps for them where all the red placards are, and it lists the reason for why they got a red placard. It may be a great restaurant that meets all health standards, but if they violate labor laws and they won't make it right through an agreement with our office, they get an F, and it's put everywhere. And it's kind of like a name and shame situation. In addition to like the restaurant being shut down. In terms of like our efforts around domestic workers and really supporting, like increased protections for them, we're working with our community advocates. We are still limited by a county structure where our police powers only exist in an unincorporated area, which is a very small segment. It's usually very pretty hillsides and like large tracts of land that have sheep and goats. But we remain optimistic that if we create laws there and create a model that can be just taken off of the shelf for cities to apply, and then to offer ourselves up as a contracting body to help the enforcement on their side of things, we're hoping that will yield some really positive results. We're not quite there yet. That's kind of like our next year plan. It was originally this year's plan, but then COVID got in the way and the world started burning down. But and in terms of like how to put this in states, red states, we have great county partnerships, and I think looking at the county model has been something that hasn't really been looked at in the years of enforcement. And even if counties were left to their own devices to leverage their unique permitting powers to enforce labor standards, I think that can go a long way. And we're hoping to create a model for other counties as well to follow, to let them know, don't worry, the county did not burn down, businesses did not shutter, we were okay in this, and it's okay.
Thank you.
Final words,
I want to thank everybody. That's great. I want to thank everybody for their great attention. This has been really wonderful. You three are heroes to me. And thank you for everything you do. And thank you to Jake Barnes, who's helped me, my partner in crime, preparing for this panel. See you all very soon. Thanks again.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Yeah,
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Janice.
Thank you.
Thank you.